Good afternoon. My name is Nigel Hollett. I'm the Director Wales of the CLA. Welcome to our event, Heritage, an Asset or Nightmare. This very much frames the debate that we're trying to have this afternoon. We're very pleased to have some excellent speakers this afternoon, and I'll introduce these shortly. Our members own or manage around half of the rural land in England and Wales. Many of our members have large estates, have large heritage dimensions, but also a large proportion of our members might just have a small listed building or barns that are ready for conversion, or small amounts of heritage assets that they're very proud of and just wondering what they might do with them. We are very much focusing on the business aspects of heritage today, such as, for example, how do you meet your obligations through the planning system? How do you meet your obligations in having a listed building? What support is available? What grants might be available? What can you do with your assets? Or how can you improve the business performance of those that you've already got? Where is your market? What can you actually do next? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Jonathan Thompson, our Heritage Advisor at the CLA. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I can't obviously cover everything about heritage in Wales in 10 minutes, so I'm going to focus on what is probably the biggest question I get asked by CLA members, which is how do I get consent to do things? The key point really about heritage is that there are two kinds of heritage. There's heritage that somebody else owns, which is not your problem. And this is Castle Koch, which is Cadw's problem, but not a problem for the rest of us. Heritage that you own is a different matter. It may be big or small, as Nigel was saying, but the problems here are your problems. The problems really are costs and controls. I won't say very much about costs because it's rather obvious perhaps, but there are lots of zeros on the costs, and they tend to escalate above what you were expecting. So that's all quite difficult. Control. Why do we have controls over heritage? Well, really because I think heritage is seen as a public good, using the term loosely. The public interest in heritage is widely felt to justify regulating the rights of the owner. In practice, most or nearly all owners agree with that, or perhaps I should say that they would if the regulation was appropriate and proportionate, not always the case. This is perhaps the worst kind of public good because people tell you what to do with heritage, but they hardly ever offer you any money. The other positive thing about the public interest is that there are opportunities from it. Public can be users, tenants, customers, and so on, which clearly can help with the problems. Heritage gets designated, I won't go through this in detail, but of course there are listed buildings and scheduled monuments, parks and gardens, World Heritage Sites, conservation areas. Worth just briefly looking at non-designated heritage, which hasn't been designated in that sense, but is still material in the planning process. So something you need to take into account. In Wales, this tends to be called historic assets of special local interest. Finally, setting, which is not a designation, but the effects on the setting of heritage, again, on material in the planning process. So that's something to bear in mind. You often need consent, not always, but where you do, that may be listed building consent or scheduled monument consent, and or you may need planning permission, and you often need planning permission where there's no heritage, of course, but where there is heritage, it tends to be considerably more difficult and or expensive. Of course, there are other non-heritage consents I won't talk about today, building regulations and licenses and so on. Do these controls work? Heritage protection kind of went in the 70s from no control, you could kind of bulldoze anything that you liked, to maximum control. You kind of needed 6 consents before you could cough. Does the system work? Which really means, does it encourage good change and discourage bad change? Many people, not just owners, were, and to some extent still are, concerned that it didn't work. It is now considerably improved in theory, perhaps a bit less so in practice. To look a bit at the traditional approach to heritage, which I'm calling here prohibit, control, punish. This might be a bit of a caricature, but not that much. It's a rules-based approach, and the rules are something like this. Firstly, that heritage must be preserved, the P word, essentially unchanged in aspic, the presumption in favour of preservation. And there's a kind of statement of this in the 1996 Welsh Office Circular, which compares historic buildings to antiques, paintings and manuscripts, which is not quite how I would see it, but that's what that says. The second rule is about, quote, historic fabric, which is kind of the actual bricks and stones and mortar, that especially must not be touched. The third rule is that essentially any component, even a wholly inappropriate component like a 1950s hideous tiled fireplace, must be kept because it's, quote, parts of the history of the building. The fourth rule is about use. Really, the only appropriate use is the original use. And a building, even if redundant, still has to be used in that use. And the fifth rule is that the decisions are taken by heritage experts in the local authority. The sixth rule is that the needs and views of the owner essentially are irrelevant in that. The seventh rule is that the needs of the building, which is primarily for viability, is also irrelevant. And the eighth rule is that the function of the owner is really just to pay the cost of whatever the local authority decides. Rule 9 is that any guidance or certainty is bad because it fetters the discretion of the expert on the day. And I think I have two rule 9s here, never mind. The 10th rule is that transgressions carry draconian punishments, at least in theory, imprisonment, huge fines. And you may be thinking that this isn't perhaps a perfect system. And it does give rise to the sort of question, why did this not cause complete disaster? And I think the answer to that probably is that it was a sort of safety valve in that the experts in local authorities could choose, if they chose, to waive some of these rules, and quite often they did. Fortunately, things have moved on a bit from that over the last 40 or so years. Just moving quickly to Australia, there was a chap called James Semple Kerr who did a lot of thinking about this and kind of developed a conservation approach to heritage, which found its way into the Australian Borough Charter in 1979, and there was more international thinking about that. There was lobbying from the CLA and other bodies that led in time to Historic England's policy or claimed policy of constructive conservation. In Wales, it led to Cadw's conservation principles 10 years ago. And most importantly, in a Welsh context, there was the Welsh Historic Environment Review starting in about 2012, led by Cadw, which led to new Cadw guidance on heritage, which is pretty important. This new conservation approach has a number of sort of aspects to it. The first is that heritage is conserved, not preserved. So the P word goes, at least in theory. The second aspect is that conservation is not keeping things exactly as they are. It's defined as the process of managing change. The third point, also important, is that conservation is not of every single aspect of everything. It's of significance. In other words, what actually matters about the building or the heritage. The fourth point is that heritage needs a viable use if it is to survive, and change of use is okay if it achieves that. Fifthly, proportionality. This is particularly about the amount of information that you're expected to provide with applications, which ought to be proportionate. And the sixth point is about guidance and advice. This is now okay under this system. And as I said, Cadw has published a lot of really useful guidance in the last 6 or 7 years. Has this solved the problems? I think, well, it's certainly much better on paper, but it might get ignored by local authorities in practice. And the word preservation still remains in the legislation, and also actually in the highest level of guidance, unfortunately, in Wales, which is why I recommend the Cadw guidance rather than the CAN, which is the highest level of guidance. There are problems on the ground. The system is really a sort of traditional big state system, which means that local authorities are supposed to have big teams of heritage skilled conservation officers, and unfortunately they don't. Perhaps never did, but certainly don't now. Further reform is needed to reduce these problems, but that I wouldn't hold your breath. In practice, the key point really is that success is largely up to you. So here are 9 rules for success. Although actually there's a sort of 10th rule at the beginning, which is first think about bats and wildlife, because otherwise they come back to bite you at the end, and you don't want to be bitten by a bat. These rules really are thinking first about strategy before you do anything. You don't get an architect in to design your home cinema room, removing 6 medieval walls. The first thing you do is to investigate and analyse and understand the building and its significance, technical term, to get to know it well, also think about its structure and its defects. And secondly, consider the building's long-term practicality and viability. And thirdly, work out your objectives, particularly how can you ensure practicality and viability. And fourthly, if those things need you to think that you need to change something, change the building, then in putting together your proposals, make sure you do something that respects the building's significance, treat it with respect. That generally isn't particularly hard if you've been through the first few steps. It isn't usually a huge conflict. Fifthly, you don't only need to do that, you also need to explain in the application that you have done it, but also how you've done it. And sixthly, it's a very good idea to quote the Cadw guidance in your application, reminding the local authority to follow that approach, rather than perhaps an approach based on the traditional philosophy I was talking about earlier. Seventhly, treat the local authority in a professional way. I mean, obviously you don't treat it with arrogance, but you also don't want to go to the other extreme. You don't go cap in hand on your knees to the local authority saying, please let me extend my kitchen, because this is supposed to be a logical process run by professionals, and so you should treat the local authority as professionals. You can do all of that yourself, and the CLA guidance notes should enable you to do that if you want to, but if you don't want to do it yourself, use a carefully selected professional. The final point really is that if you follow those rules, you should be okay. You should get consent. But if you do run into problems, you're sure you've been following the rules, persevere. You may well get consent, or even if you can't do that, you may win an appeal. And you can get to the end of the project, like this project on the screen here. That probably is getting me to near the end of my time. I promised at the beginning that I would talk about a guidance note, and that was the first on this list of guidance notes here. It's called Getting Heritage Consents in Wales. There are also a series of other guidance notes, which you'll find on the website. So I think that is the end.
So thank you very much, Jonathan. Okay, on to our next speaker now. I'm delighted that we've managed to get Judith Alfrey, who's the Head of Regeneration and Conservation at Cadw, to tell us a bit more about what you do, Judith, and how Cadw can help. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that introduction, and also thank you, Jonathan. We didn't confer, Jonathan and I, but as you'll see, we will actually be going over some of the same ground, or I'll be going over some of the ground that he's already gone over. But obviously, I will be doing that from Cadw's perspective, and I hope that you'll quickly realise that I am absolutely not defending the traditional approach that he outlined so eloquently. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is really to help you to get to know Cadw better. As you may know, Cadw is the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service, and I want to stress that because we are actually in government. The arrangements in Wales are really quite different from the arrangements over the border. So we are actually a division of Welsh Government, and to some extent that sort of colours the way that we do things. We're an organisation in two parts. We do, as Jonathan's already alluded to, we do actually have property of our own. So there's part of Cadw is properties in care, and then there's the other part, which has responsibility for what we just call the wider historic environment, really, everything else. And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about heritage assets that are owned by people other than Cadw. So that means you, really. So that's assets that are owned by and obviously cared for by others. So again, as Jonathan's already said, really, whatever the ownership, there's very strong public interest in protecting our heritage, which means that public authorities like Cadw, as well as owners, have a stake in managing it. So over the next few minutes, I want to try and outline what Cadw's stake in that process is. So I'm going to start with listed buildings. We designate buildings for listing and at the moment there are just over 30,000 listed buildings in Wales. We completed a geographical resurvey of the whole of Wales in 2005, and since then we've been adding to the tally of listed buildings through spot listing. Essentially, that's a sort of reactive process, really. At the moment, we respond to around 90 to 100 requests for listing every year. Obviously, not all of those result in a new listing. Some of them do. And I should say that I guess probably the majority of those requests come in from private individuals. Some of them come from local authorities or amenity societies, but a lot of them come from private individuals. We don't grant listed building consent. That's a matter for local authorities. But we do have a formal role in the listed building consent process because it's actually our responsibility to consider whether or not cases can be determined by the local planning authorities. So if they're minded to grant consent, they, with some exceptions actually, but in general, they notify us. We also advise the Planning Inspectorate on appeals, and for those reasons we don't get involved in discussion of listed building consent cases once an application's been submitted. Having said that, we can offer advice while proposals are being formulated, so we can get involved at the pre-application stage, and in fact we like to get involved early on whenever we can. Because we feel that we can, add the greatest value from and get the most out of our expertise if we're involved early on in the process. Having said that, Jonathan referred to the big state, and I that's really a cue to me to say that there are actually only 3 historic buildings inspectors for the whole of Wales. So, we have to be quite sparing about when we get involved, and we do have to prioritise. The 3 inspectors work regionally. They've been working regionally for some time now, and that means that not only have they been able to, develop good working relationships with the local authorities on their patch, but it also gives them a reasonable chance of getting to know listed building owners too. Moving on, scheduled monuments. These are monuments of national importance. There are just over 4,000 of those. Scheduling is intended to protect archaeological evidence. So it's the monument, its setting, any artifact or environmental evidence associated with it. We do the scheduling, but we also give consent for works that would physically alter a monument. So we are the consenting body for scheduled monuments. But in addition to that, we're also consultees in the planning process for developments that might affect the setting of a scheduled monument. As with listed buildings, we're very, very happy to give advice on matters relating to scheduled monuments. Those of you who own one may already have met one of the network of field monument wardens who make periodic visits to all the monuments across Wales. And we also have a small team of ancient monument inspectors. Next up, historic parks and gardens. So we register parks and gardens that are of special historic interest. For these, as I'm sure you know, there isn't a consent regime. So we don't normally get involved in the day-to-day management maintenance of registered historic parks and gardens. They are protected chiefly through the planning system, and we are consulted on planning applications for developments that might affect a registered park and garden or its setting. Once again, we are very happy to offer advice when we can on proposals for change. But once again, our resources are actually spread quite thinly here because we just have one inspector for historic parks and gardens for the whole of Wales. She provides our planning advice and would also advise on new registration. So she's actually, she has her hands full. But I know that she does try and get out and give advice when she can. Probably aware that the register is in the process of becoming statutory. And as part of that, we actually took the opportunity to review the extent of all the parks and gardens that are currently registered. We've been doing a we've been consulting owners on those boundaries, and that exercise is almost complete. So we hope that statutory status will be achieved later this year. Assets with some kind of special status, though, are only part of the story, and there are many, many more features that give character to our landscape and are testimony to our history. You might be relieved to know that actually Cadw has no formal remit for that wider historic environment, but we do feel that we have a kind of responsibility towards it, and we do try and work to foster an interest and understanding of it. I'm not really going to say anything about that other than just to, by way of an example, really, to say that we recently launched an initiative which has a focus on encouraging people to explore their local heritage. That was very much a product of the experience of lockdown, when people were thrown onto the resources of their neighbourhood, and we wanted to encourage people to get to know what was the heritage that was on their doorsteps. Everything we do within a very specific legislative and policy framework. The first was enabled by the 2016 Historic Environment Wales Act, and that is heritage partnership agreements. These will be voluntary arrangements for the long-term management of scheduled monuments and listed buildings, and they'll be negotiated between owners, the consenting authority or authorities, and other interested parties. I don't know if you're aware, but there's a consultation, a Welsh Government consultation at the moment on the regulations and guidance for heritage partnership agreements, and the deadline for responses to that is the 12th of April, so there's still a bit of time if you wanted to have a look. Also, I just wanted to mention that work is getting underway on the consolidation of historic environment legislation. That'll be the first step towards consolidating the whole of the law book for Wales. It'll modernise the form and drafting of the legislation, but it won't change the legal effect. Obviously, the bill itself will be a matter for the next Assembly. We have, over the last few years, produced a raft of guidance documents. Here are some of them. All of them are available on our website. What they all do is attempt to sort of show, to sort of put into practice our guiding principles. What they try to do is to balance the needs of the historic environment as a finite, non-renewable resource, and with a recognition that change is often necessary and actually also often desirable. We, I think, recognise change as actually a necessary part of keeping the value of our historic environment alive. And I do actually feel quite strongly about this, because I think when we talk about heritage, we are talking about something that has value to all of us. And if we're going to keep that value, if we're going to sort of nurture that value and keep it going, we do actually, I think, have to recognise we have to be responsive and recognise the inevitability of change. And that might be responding to just, the natural process of decay, sort of wear and tear brought about by use. We might be responding to the challenges of climate change. But it might also be about repurposing redundant buildings, because a building that no longer has a use is actually, it's going to kind of lose its value and its significance very quickly if we're not careful. So we do, I think, try to recognise that and recognise that in order to be really valued, things have to have a sort of living meaning in our culture today, and that very likely does mean that changes will have to be made. So defining conservation as the careful management of change means that we in Cadw are more likely to be talking about the best way to enable change to be made than we are to be talking about preventing it.
We're going to move on to a very much a business focus. Jacet Harlech, thank you ever so much for joining us this afternoon. Jacet, I'll leave you introduce yourself, but in a nutshell, you're the owner of a fabulous estate in North Wales, and we look forward to finding more about what you've actually done in practice.
I'm going to take you through a bit of a quick run through of what's been happening at the Glyn estate, and in particular our listed building, Glyn Cadw. This is a view here taken fairly recently, and this is the gatehouse with full 360 scaffolding as we took on the roof repair. This was actually a second phase of the works that we did, having first started the restoration of the hall. So where are we? We're in the historical county of Merioneth. Glyn Cawlwch is a hall at the centre of the estate, which is 5,000 acre rural estate. So we fall in the jurisdiction of both Gwynedd Council and Snowdonia National Park. Glyn, as we know it now, was built in 1616 by William and Catherine Wynne, who were the parents to the bard Ellis Wynne, and his writings on the wall can still be seen in what's known as the Poets' Room today. It was restored quite extensively by my predecessors, the Ormsby Gores, in the 1870s, and received its grade 2-star listed status in 1966. Cadw describe it as an ambitious gentry house of Renaissance character. It was refurbished again in the 1970s by my grandfather, the 5th Lord Harlech, and the current restoration started in 2017 and is ongoing. This is another view of the house, and in the background, the gatehouse. Photo will give you a bit of a glimpse of the situation when I took over. The state of the building was extremely deleterious. A lot of the materials used in the 1970s restoration, although I'm sure they followed an approach of kind of sparing no expense and doing it, you know, to a really high quality of work. Things like gypsum plaster, cement, concrete, all of that had really, you know, degraded badly over time. In the attic rooms, the ceilings had all started to come down. There was a lot of water ingress. You know, the wiring, everything was not fit for purpose anymore. So I realized that given the full scale of works, I was going to need, you know, professional advice, top quality contractors, and being in the park, the as Judith said, you know, there are planning authorities. So I felt it was really important to get that conversation going early on, start building that relationship, get them around, see what it is we were up against, and then I felt that they'd understand why we wanted to do this work and make these changes. Even in the rooms that weren't kind of falling down, the condition was, as you can see, extremely poor, very little insulation, be it thermal or acoustic. You know, you've got some really dated storage heaters. It all had to be kind of redone top to bottom, but then at the same time balance those historical parameters. So what were the considerations before we started the work? Well, we had to look at the structural integrity of the building. Fortunately, the foundations were very good, and although from a, you know, decorative point of view, the building was in a bad state, fortunately structurally it was quite sound. However, there was a lot of water ingress, and so, you know, roofing work was going to be required. Obviously, the listed building consent, and then due to working with a conservation accredited architect, we felt, you know, we discussed about reinstating lime and hemp and using breathable materials in the fabric of the building, because we were going to be completely rewiring and replumbing the internal works of the building. And as any kind of, well, any house owner will tell you, your heating bills are your kind of one of your biggest concerns, aren't they? We saw this as an opportunity to look at the possibility of renewable energy, and decided after consultation to go down the route of installing a water source heat pump. This gives you a look at how the roof was constructed, and how it had to be kind of peeled back in layers. and all the works to happen in a way where you're doing as much repairing on site. Say, for example, you have a window frame and 1/10 of it is still intact. You will be made to take that window frame and remake it in a workshop, as opposed to having a new window frame made. Here they're doing works to chimney. You can see the different subsections within it, and that's the new chimney pointed up with lime. Moving outside the house then, or continuing outside, the chap in the high-vis vest is the archaeological officer from Gwynedd Council. So we needed to get the energy from the heat pump, which is sitting in obviously a water source, into the plant room, and then from the plant room, which is going to be in the gatehouse, get your domestic hot water and heating into the hall. So all of that required listed building consent and someone, as well as ecological, as well as someone to actually monitor all of the trenching works while they happened. And that's the trench having come right up to the house and then to the culvert where the new domestic hot water would come to the building. That's what the energy blades look like. That holding pool was actually a Victorian construction and was used for holding water, obviously, but then powered a sawmill down in the yard. And what's interesting about the hall is that it's not just the house and gatehouse that are listed, but it's also the gardens and even the range buildings as well. So where are we now? As I say, it started 2017. First fix is complete, plastering's done. The heat pump is installed, it works, it's commissioned, it's generating heat, which the building and the tradesmen inside it are very grateful for. We were planning to be finished this summer, but because of COVID, as you can imagine, there have been delays to the works. It has been restored as a family home, but the commercial pressures on the estate and the huge cost that's gone into restoring the building means that it will have a commercial use as well as a private hire venue. And what I would say to anyone that is thinking about owning a listed building is that you're never really an owner, you're a custodian of heritage, and you should be fully aware of sort of what you're getting into before you commit to that purchase. For me, it was slightly different because it had been in the family for a while, so I was kind of braced with the parameters that I would need to work within. This is a shot of the attic, fully stripped out. You can see the new piping, electrical work, alarm system, fire detection system, sprinkler system, and then this is it, all plastered up again. I won't go into this anymore. I'm aware of the time, but just that, as Jonathan said, get as much advice as you can, because pretty much anything you do, in fact, I would say everything you want to do will require listed building consent, and it's a criminal offence to do works without it. Ecology, I know this is not the subject of today's talk, but pretty much all listed buildings, because of their age, will have some ecological things, so bear that in mind. Seek advice. If you're a member of CLA, get the advice. I'd strongly recommend joining historic houses. They've got wonderful advisors as well. And like I said, get that dialogue happening early with your planning officer, with Cadw, and it'll just make the journey much smoother. I couldn't have done this job without a conservation accredited architect, so I would say that's almost a mandatory consideration as well. And then just finally, this Donald Rumsfeld quote: "It'll cost way more than you think it will." There's known knowns. the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So if you already are a heritage owner and you're feeling frustrations with the system, I think asking for things to be delisted is going to be very unrealistic. I don't think that's a likely outcome, but there are things you can do. Lobby your member of Senate and member of Parliament for VAT reductions and relief to heritage maintenance funds. And there's advice on both CLA and historic houses about how to do that.
Can I now hand over, please, to Phil Godsell, who's the owner of Yscoed Park?
So I live at Yscoed Park, which is situated on the Welsh side of the Welsh-Shropshire border near Wrexham. Yscoed is a grade 2-star listed house, and I live in the house with Susie, my wife, and 3 children, Poppy, Hector, and Cecily. And until March, we shared it with 20 full-time, 15 part-time staff, and around 12,000 guests a year. We currently have a total of 20 bedrooms to rent, and 9 of these are in the main house, and the others are in some cottages and outbuildings around this area. In normal times, we hold about 100 to 110 weddings a year, private parties and company retreats, supper clubs, regular Sunday lunches and afternoon teas as well. And we have been constantly restoring and renovating the house since we took over from my father in September 2009. The main house dates from 1737, although there are some older parts, and there was a dwelling here for many centuries before the main house was built. And in the war, the house the house in the park was requisitioned, and it took quite a hammering. Following my grandfather's death in 1982, it looked actually like Yscoed was going to have to be sold. Fortunately, the revenue accepted the house and main contents were of outstanding architectural, historic and artistic importance, and tax exemption was granted. And on condition that the house is kept in a good state of repair, public access is provided, and the house is not sold. So it was in a bad place, and despite the huge challenges it presented, my father decided to take Yscoed on due to the conditional exemption, much to the annoyance of the agents who are rubbing their hands with glee at my grandfather's funeral at the prospect of handling what they considered to be the inevitable sale of Yscoed. We therefore moved from our warm, cosy Suffolk house to a cold, leaking Yscoed in 1984. My father set about completely re-roofing the house, as there was death watch beetle, and there were huge holes in the roof, and the lead was perished, and it really was in a dire state. This was the same with many of the outbuildings, and at this point, Cadw really came to our rescue and gave us some extremely important grants, which enabled my father to carry out the restoration, which basically saved the main house and a lot of the outbuildings, which would have certainly otherwise perished. Anyway, it was clear that when it was the next generation's turn, that we were going to have to think of, we were going to have to diversify. There is a estate of about 750 acres, but it's not nearly enough to keep a house like Yscoed going. And so therefore, we needed to think about how we could create a business that would not only fund the enormous restoration that was now needed, but also would then bring in an income to keep the house going in the future. So after looking at various business models, my wife Susie and I were living in London, and we wrote a business plan to turn Esgoed into a wedding venue. The house itself wasn't really suitable at first for a commercial wedding venue, because we needed an area that could seat at least 100 people for a dinner, and have a ceremony of 100 people, and also a party space, and all these spaces need to be linked together. So you can see these plans. This is a plan of the ground floor, and a before and after. We basically enlisted a conservation architect called Claire Craven, who was fantastic and helped us put together a plan which basically reorganized the back of the house. The back of the house is where all the old kitchens were, the sculleries, where it was completely unusable for a modern, in the modern day, totally impractical. And so we put together a plan which were going to take down the big chimneys and reorganize this whole part of the house. And you can see that under the chimneys and all the ivy, when we stripped it back, we could, there were these signs that had been arches there. And that gave us the sort of the point of our plan by reinstating those arches, taking down the chimneys, removing some of these old ad hoc modern buildings, that we could create an area that we could make into a large room, and big enough, and also by having the arches, we could create a terrace to deal with the different levels, and by siting a marquee there, we could then create a house that would allow us to have 160 people dining, people seated for a ceremony and a party, and it all flowed in the right way. So once we got that plan sorted, we had a meeting with Cadw, the Georgian group, and the Wrexham planners, and we basically presented what we intended to do, and we showed that this was taking elements of the house, from its past history, and turning an area of the house that was completely unusable, and by doing it in a very sympathetic way, we could provide an income for this house and keep it relevant and keep it going. So it was a major undertaking, and there was a lot of work. So this is the before, and then this is what it looks like today. So taking a really redundant area and making it come alive. I think it was very important having those early meetings with Cadw and getting and the planners, and getting everyone sort of excited about the project, and it really did help us move on and get the thing underway. This is what the house looked like before. This is what it looked like now. We had to employ, so it was a listed garden as well, so we had to employ some garden designers. We had Michael Bolston did the structural design, and Zara Tolomash, who is a fantastic plants woman, who she created the planting plan. And we had to design a garden that worked well with the house, but also was useful for weddings, receptions, photographs, etc. Now, that was our electric board when we turned over. So there was a lot to do within the house itself, apart from those major structural elements. We had to rewire, replumb. I mean, the entire house from the cellar, where we had to remove all the asbestos, up to the attic has taken 8 years to complete, and that has been quite a transformation. All the way through our projects, we really want to make it still feel like a family home, and we have been very careful to sort of pay respect to the history, the traditional, the sort of family things that we've collected over generations that give it its heart and its personality, and then we have tried to infuse that with a sort of elements of contemporary design, and make it a workable place, you know, in this century. So we've now got, you know, until COVID hit, we had a big team, and I have to say it's one of the most distressing things about COVID is for us here is that we've lost, you know, most of our team. We've got a few left on furlough, but it takes a long time to build a team. And I'm sort of showing you this shot because I feel that it just shows the importance behind making these heritage buildings work. It's so important to keep looking at the future. It's so important to see what's around the corner when you can, and look at how things are changing.
Thank you ever so much, and I think we could have an hour on your business, and the same, quite frankly, for you, Jacet, as well. Could I ask everybody just to turn their videos on so we can all see you? For our guests, we are running slightly over time, but I think it just reflects the amazing work that certainly our members are doing, and also the advice and support that we're offering under links that Cadw have got into this hugely important area. Could I pass over to the question from Bernard Llewellyn from Carrick Henning about, I think what Bernard's trying to say is, are there any marketing or policy changes resulting from COVID? That's probably one for you, I think, Judith, or possibly Jonathan.
I would actually be struggling to answer that, I'm afraid. I don't know whether Jonathan is better placed to pick it up.
I'm not sure I quite follow the question. I mean, clearly, all kinds of people, particularly people with hospitality businesses, have been very, very badly hit, as Philip in particular was telling us. And there are various schemes that have been put together by government. I think government has put somewhere between 100 and 300 million into heritage, that maybe across the UK, not just in Wales, over the last year. So there has been quite a lot of support in terms of grants and loans, but at the same time, it's only sort of certainly not covering all the costs by any means, and lots of people have fallen through the cracks.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. Conscious of time, everybody. Judith, I wonder whether you could just come back on the question from either Mr. or Mrs. Baker, please, about non-designated heritage assets. Anything around that, please?
Yeah, I can try to. I'm actually, I have to say, I'm very slightly mystified about that. I know that local authorities can maintain lists of assets of special local interest, and if they maintain a list, then they have to have policies. There have to be policies in their linked to their LDP that directly address the issue of assets of special local interest. But I don't think it really went the other way. So I'm not entirely sure that I can answer that question without sort of understanding a little bit more about it. So I'm more than happy for my email address to be shared, and I can try and to understand a little bit more what's behind that, and try and answer it properly with that better understanding. I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you, Judith. And what we'll do is we'll come back to everybody in relation to your questions. If they're easy, we've answered them. If they're not, we'll come back to everybody directly. So I'm going to, I think, pull the event to a close now. We've gone slightly over, but I think that reflects the fabulous slides that we've had already. Could I maybe ask you, Jacet, for a final word on what you might want to say to anybody thinking of getting involved in heritage buildings? 1 or 2 words?
Do your research.
Fabulous. Well answered. That's brilliant. And Phil, I think you were talking about diversification, but any quick couple of words from you to finish off the event.
Yeah, I mean, just expect that the next day you can never tell what's around the corner, and you need to try and prepare for the unexpected.
Judith, again, putting you on the spot. Couple of words to finish off the event.
Gosh, you have put me on the spot. Only I think that actually the two presentations that we saw in detail actually sort of they very much show conservation in action, and I actually thought that they were both very inspiring illustrations of really what I was talking about in theory, which is about the necessity to make changes to breathe new life into heritage assets and really make them work as really for us as part of our heritage in a very kind of lived and living way. And so I'd just like to say thank you for that. I thought they were both inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And Jonathan, last but not least, we want everybody that's not a member to join the CLA, don't we, to get fabulous advice. But maybe I'm answering half your question for you. But final words before I close.
Yes, please join if you aren't already. We can definitely help you. I suppose, in one word, I would say persevere. And because that isn't easy, maybe I turn that into 3 words and say persevere and perspire.
Thank you, everybody. Such a wonderful seminar. And thank you all so much for your input. We were delighted that we've had so many people coming to our event. I hope we can do the next one in person, but thank you very much for attending our event this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you all very soon.